So for our first scenario, the boss wants us to create a transaction that will add an invoice and then a couple of line items for that invoice. And it should be one complete transaction. So if the invoice fails, then the line items won't be added. And if one of the line items fails, it's going to roll back out of everything. So it's kind of an all or nothing scenario here. And I've already entered the information. The transaction itself, what we're going to be doing is right here. So here's our insert on invoices. And it is helpful to kind of look at the invoice table so you can kind of see what it's doing. It's going to automatically generate the invoice ID. So we begin by adding the vendor ID, followed by the invoice number, the invoice date. This is the total. And then we've got the payment and credit total, which are 0. The terms is 3. This is when the payment is due, and they haven't paid yet, so that's null. Now, in order to add our line items, we have to have that invoice ID. It's actually part of the key for the line items. So we are retrieving that using at identity. Okay, that will give us the key that was just generated. Now we need to store that value so that we can use it on our insert statements for the line items. So you'll notice that above the transaction, I've declared a variable at invoice ID as an integer. I declared it as an integer because that is what is being generated for invoice ID. So we take that value that was generated and we're storing it here. Okay, then we can do the insert for line items. We're giving it the invoice ID because that's stored in our variable. And then the sequence number, this is the first line item. And actually, that should be 60 there. This is our first line item. The account number is 160. And then this is the amount and a description of hardware upgrade. This is our second line item. Okay, and so it's going to be the same invoice ID, but a different sequence number. And it's that combination of ID and sequence number that has to be unique. Then the account number, 160, followed by the amount and the description. So either all of this is going to work or it's going to back out of everything. So you'll notice that we have that inside begin tran, and at the bottom we have commit tran. So if it gets down here, that means it worked. Now what happens if it doesn't get down there? Well, that's where the try and catch come into play. You are going to want to use try catch with transaction processing because if there's an error, it'll go down to the catch block where you can then roll back the transaction and you can print out an error message. Okay, and so you'll notice that we have a begin catch and an end catch right below the begin and end try. Okay, and then just to make sure that everything looked okay, I did a little select on vendor 34, and that would show us all of their invoices, and we definitely should be able to see this one. So let's go ahead and execute, and let me pull this up. And so we can see I've actually run this more than once. It didn't just add it twice. Let me run this again for you. So I'm going to right click on invoices. ID 132, 133. I'm going to delete them and then I'm going to run it again just to show you that it works. Okay, so I'm going to delete this guy. And we'll delete this guy. And this is set up to delete the line items if you delete the invoice. So no worry on those. And let me run this again. And you can see it did only add it once. So it does work. It's got all the information that we would expect. Okay, and so this is our first task, which is now complete. So I'm going to move my closing comment down. And I've already saved this as chapter 16 textbook assignment. So you're going to want to hit save and then save it under that name. And we're moving on to our next task. So this task involves deleting a vendor from our invoices table. We're only expecting one invoice, and if there are more than one, then we don't want to delete the vendor. And the vendor that we are going to delete is vendor 34. Well, looking at vendor 34, I can already see that there's 3 invoices. So this is not going to work. So it's going to end up rolling it back. But this is kind of good practice for us. So I'm going to pause while I copy paste the code, and then we'll talk about what it's doing. All right, so we have our begin tran, and you can see the command that is the transaction is our delete. Okay, and so then we're going to check the row count. If the row count is more than 1, okay, we have a begin and an end for that if. We're going to roll back the transaction and print out a little error message. Okay. If it is not more than 1, okay, then we have our else with a begin and an end. We're going to commit the transaction and print out that it was successful. Okay, and what we're expecting on this is we are going to see that error message. Okay, so the vendor was not deleted. Okay, it rolled it back because there was more than 1. So if you wanted to just double check on that, let's move this down. Okay, we could actually copy this and paste it down here and run it, and you would still see those same 3. Okay, so let me get rid of that. So it did roll back and it did not commit that deletion. For the next scenario, we are going to create a temporary table. And in that temporary table, we're going to place vendor ID and vendor name. And then this is designed for us to practice basically executing a transaction and committing it and saving that commit under a name. So we're going to do it a couple times, and then you'll see how you can roll back to a certain point using that named save or the named commit. So I'm going to pause while I set this up, and then I'm going to walk you through what it's doing. So the first thing we're doing in here is we're checking to see if that temporary table exists. We're naming it vendor copy. If it does exist, then we're getting rid of it. And then the next thing we're doing is we're creating it. So if we didn't check for that temporary table and it was there, we would get an error when we tried to create it. Okay, so this just prevents any error. And then what we want to do to that vendor copy table is we're going to be deleting vendors. So the first thing we do is delete vendor 1, and then we save that under the name vendor 1. Okay, so the only thing that transaction has in it is that first deletion. Then we delete vendor 2 and we save that as vendor 2. Then we delete vendor 3. So at this point, if we did a select, it's only going to show one vendor. Now, in our vendor table, we said to add the vendors that have an ID of less than 5. So that would be what vendors 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So we've deleted 1, 2, and 3. So if we did a select here, okay, it's only going to show us vendor 4. Then, if we did a rollback and we rolled back to this point, okay, what is it going to show us? Well, it is going to show us vendor 3, and it's going to show us vendor 4. Okay, and to prove that, we're doing a little select here. Then what happens if we roll it back to this point? Okay, if we roll it back to this point, it is going to show us vendor 2, vendor 3, and vendor 4. Okay, and then when we do our commit at the end, what we should see is vendor 2, 3, and 4. So let's go ahead and run this. Oops, it does not like it when I have things highlighted. So this first one is from our first little select here. Okay, so it's only showing vendor 4. This second one with 3 and 4 is from our second select. Then we have our third select where it's showing 2, 3, and 4. And that ends up being what we actually have in the table because we did our final commit and it did indeed delete vendor 1. So basically with these saves, it just gives you different points that you can roll back to. Okay, so it's not an all or nothing deal. That is the advantage of using it.